Thank you so much to everybody who has joined us this evening for this latest conversation in the Brunel Writer Series. I know that we have some students here and some people from the wider world, so it's great to have this late afternoon, early evening literary adventure to share with you all. So thanks so much for being here. I'm sure that everybody is very familiar with Joe's work, but just to give a little bit of an introduction, Joe was born and raised in Swansea, but now lives in London, where I think he's beaming in from this evening. His debut novel, Submarine, was translated into 20 languages and was made into an award-winning film by the same name, of course. His second novel, Wild Abandon, went on to win the Encore Award, and his third, The Adulterants, was published in 2018. Joe's first collection of poems, O Positive, was published by Faber and Faber in 2019. And in particular, we were delighted to have Joe join us this evening because Submarine, his debut novel, is on the syllabus for the undergraduate English degree at Brunel University. So as a guest lecturer this year, I've had the great pleasure of teaching this novel to the students and discussing it with them. And so we're absolutely delighted to have you here, Joe, to get to talk to you about it and all sorts of other things to do with your writing. But so thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. Yeah, I'm so pleased and excited you guys have been reading the book.
Oh, does it feel scary at all to know your debut is being scrutinized by these contemporary literature students?
Yeah, it really does, especially because I guess it's, how old is it now? Maybe 15 years old? So it just feels like, I mean, we were talking about it earlier on, I haven't gone back to read it, but I imagine there's various passages I would not write now, not write it if I read it now. So yeah, it's definitely unnerving to think of all these bright young minds tearing it apart.
Oh, well, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about your feelings about it as the conversation goes on. But it just struck me that the book is as old now as Oliver is in the book.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Yes, he'd be 30 now. Yeah, okay.
Gosh, so well, I know that we thought it would be a really nice thing to kick off with one of the poems from your poetry collection. So if you're okay to do that, I think that'd be a great way to get us started. Are you going to read something from O Positive or something else?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to read a shortish one. It's about a father who is worried his daughter is falling in love with some owls. It's called Owls in Law. These birds have no idea how to behave, pouring glasses of water for just themselves, regurgitating pellets of compressed bone, and now landing on my daughter's arms. As she laughs, their apertured eyelids click. When she asks which of them are single, their lighthouse smiles sweep the room. That night, I watch my daughter sleep. I'm at her bedside, there in the eaves. As she starts to dream, her eyes toil in their sockets. I warn the owls not to mistake this twitching for field mice and pluck them out. I know from research the power of their zygodactyl talons. Their wings are silent when they descend, claws now trimmed and tagged with commitment rings. Her eyes stay shut as they grip her clavicles, rising gently between rafters. They hide in a darkness to which my sight cannot adjust. I listen for her cries, but hear only deepening breath.
Wow, that was amazing. Gosh, I hate to break the spell. I just want you to keep going. We should have just done poetry hour and you could have read to us all evening. I think that's the most relaxed I've been in weeks. Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
And I suppose it leads me to ask my first question, which is that, we know you're a novelist and a poet and you write short stories and screenplays and so many different things. Does the form and the spark of the idea come to you at the same time, or does the form inspire the content or the content inspire the form or vice versa? Like, how do you know what it is that you're writing? When does that happen?
I guess the answer is that it's different every time, more or less. Like there are cases where it's clear what the form is. Like, I can think of certain short stories, but it was just obvious it was kind of the only form that would accommodate that story. But there are various occasions when I thought something's a poem and it's kind of grown and become a short story, or quite often things start as poems and then I just think they don't work as a poem, but I strip mine all the good lines and put them in a little document, and later they come into a novel. In fact, Submarine is quite a good example of that, in that I was writing lots of poetry, but I wasn't always that happy with the poetry I was writing at that point, but there were always, well, often one or two lines I was happy with, and I was taking them out and trying to find ways to put them in Submarine. So like, reading through, you'd probably be like, that's obviously a line he recovered from a poem. So yeah, it does run both ways. And yeah, I guess I sometimes just try the story out in a few different shapes to see which fits.
Gosh, it's so interesting. And I just want to jump on when you say there about if it feels like it wasn't working. And this is sort of the magic in it all, isn't it? I mean, what does that mean to you if something is working on the page?
Yeah, that's a really profound question, isn't it, about the writing mind and what it means to what your own relationship to your work is. And actually, I think what I find really interesting about that is that I find my concept of my own writing changes through the day. So I actually tried to draw a graph of this to like pinpoint my own feelings. So I wake up and I always feel really good about my writing in the morning. I can just wake up, I think I'm just a genius, and I write through the morning. I'm like, everything I touch this is just perfect. But it slowly tails off, and I think around like 1:30 is where I actually have an accurate idea of my own writing. And then through the afternoon, I start to dislike my own writing more and more and more, until kind of like 3 or 4 o'clock, and I hate everything I've written and I delete it all. So it's just, I think, being aware of that, being aware of how arbitrary and how changeable your own opinion of your work is an important thing for a writer, because you know that day where you wake up and you think everything you've written is terrible is not true, and the day when you wake up and you think you're a genius is also not true. So you just have to try and find a balance, and I think that's part of the skill, isn't it?
Yeah. How much of it do you think at this point is instinct, and how much of it is learned craft, in terms of you knowing, okay, yes, this is happening now?
I think it's mostly feeling. Like, I think it's mostly that sense of, because I can't, there's obviously craft elements involved in that decision, and you're making craft decisions as you go through about sentence structure, about rhythm, all these things. But I still think the sense that it's clicking, that it's really like, it's going, it's working, is a feeling thing for me. And I remember actually coming back to Submarine again, that was the first time I thought I'd written something that worked. Like, all my other work prior to that had felt just like I guess I didn't even know what working was until I wrote Submarine. Oh, right, so this is what it can feel like to do something that feels like it's working. So yeah, it's definitely, for me, I think I wouldn't be able to bullet point the reasons a piece is working at a craft level. I can say the things I liked about it on a craft level, but I think the sense of it being a success is just a feeling.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that about Submarine, because I was going to ask you about this. Was there a moment when it suddenly clicked and you felt that, okay, I can take this seriously now,
right?
To kind of identify yourself as a writer and believe that this could happen for you. And so it's amazing that was kind of your moment was with Submarine, and then that it did go on and really really work for you in such a major way. But it's incredible that you have that specific point in time where it suddenly all kind of came to place. But I mean, I'm sure for lots of people it takes a lot of writing and practicing and experimenting and getting to know your own voice before that happens. So I think for people students who are listening who haven't felt that click yet, it could be any day now.
Yeah, and I think even if it's a piece of work that doesn't completely work, I remember various pieces of writing leading up to starting Submarine that I could kind of sense that I was moving towards where I needed to be. Like I guess in the cliche of like finding your voice as a writer, I've always been slightly suspicious of that, because I think it can be a bit kind of like, if you tell, you'll know when you find your voice. It's like, well, I'm not sure if that's true, but I definitely was moving towards my subject matter anyway. And in the pieces I wrote before Submarine, I was like, that bit of this story seems to be much more interesting than the other bits. Why is that bit good? Why is that working? And then trying the next story, maybe zone in on that a little bit more, and so on and so on and so on.
So in when we think about language, do you feel that as a poet, you ask something different of language than you do as a novelist?
I mean, the novelists I like ask those questions as well, and are into, are focused at the level of the word and the rhythm and the sentence and all these things. So I don't think it's exclusive to poets, but it's definitely a mindset of poets that they are paying attention to every word. Not that I'm sure every novelist would say that they're paying attention to every word, but you read a poet's novel, and often there's a big difference between a poet's novel and other non-poets novels. So yeah.
And so where do you think this drive to write comes from? Is there an origin story in your life for your writing that you think where it all kicked off from?
I don't know exactly. I can actually, I do often think of my sister. I had two older sisters, and the kind of first time I understood the power of storytelling was my older sister. In retrospect, I now know she was plagiarizing Tolkien's The Hobbit, but I didn't realize it at the time. But we'd be walking around the house, and suddenly she'd become one of these characters. I guess it's a bit like Dungeons and Dragons or something. It was an ongoing, immersive role-playing thing where I was the protagonist and she was a huge array of characters. Sometimes she was Gollum. I hadn't read the books. I didn't know who this horrible Gollum was, but she spoke in a horrible, she said, treasure. And she kind of like would come over to me with her shaking hands. And it was, and it would happen, I just hear her change her voice, and suddenly I knew I was in the fantasy world and the game was starting again. There was no like, do you want to play now? It was just suddenly she would be one of the characters. And that really stayed with me. So whether I can say that was the beginning of my kind of love of stories, I don't know, but it's certainly the most kind of powerful example of storytelling, I think, from my childhood. And then I started writing my own comics, and later on writing lyrics for a band, and then later on, I kind of tried my hands at various things. But yeah, I think my sister's to blame.
That's amazing. Did your sister go on to write? Does she write?
No, she's a librarian now. So she actually reads, and in fact, I was my son was watching her read she works in the children's library in Cardiff. My son was watching her read one of the stories over YouTube, and she did her Gollum voice for the baddie in this little kid's book, and I was terrified, and I was taken back to being 8 years old and her creeping up to me. So yeah, she's still reading stories.
That's amazing. Would that we all had a big sister like that. I mean, the best I got, my brother used to pretend he was the Incredible Hulk and chase us around the house, and I'm not sure that's had quite the same sort of inspiring formative experience. So yeah, I mean,
that's amazing. The full Incredible Hulk backstory from the
and so just thinking about Submarine, God, as we said, it's 15 years now since it came out, and since you launched Oliver Tate onto the world. It's remarkable. What's your relationship like with it now as a novel? And with Oliver, I guess.
Yeah, I'm proud of it. I guess I haven't reread it since the time, but I'm just so proud of how it connects to people, and I'm also proud of it that it's had a life, much longer than I could possibly have imagined, and the kind of reach of it. Obviously, the film has played a huge part in that, but I never stopped being amazed by hearing from people who are still reading it now, or people from other countries who have read it. Like the other day, not the other day, a couple of years ago, I met the woman who had done the subtitles on the illegal copy, the illegal Chinese copy of Submarine that was on the internet. She's like, yeah, me and my friends took the DVD, we stayed up all night translating it into Mandarin. And I just thought, you know, these are amazing things that you could never possibly imagine happening when you're writing a book. Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing thing to think of the works in translation, and these translators sitting down, taking the particularly, you know, what Oliver might call the properly Welshy bits of the book, you know, and how that works in translation. Have you had lots of queries come through from translators asking you to kind of explain, you know, what would be their cultural equivalent of this? And I've had some of that. It's really funny, the things that people don't translate.
Yeah, I wonder if that's kind of the fun bit as a translator, you know, like when it's definitely not translatable, then there's a sense that you're going to have to find some fun workarounds. Yeah.
And I mean, Oliver, I mean, of course, I mean, we love him, but he's, you know, he's flawed and complex and complicated and nuanced, and all, you know, makes the same mistakes that so many of us did when we were adolescents, and has that, you know, incredible naivete, and he's learning on the page. And it's such part of the reason I think why people love it so much is because you've let him be that flawed in, you know, on the page, and haven't tried to pull his punches at all. But do you think, I mean, could you write a character like Oliver now? You know, do you think about readers reading him now, would they find it too problematic, some of his worldviews, you know, how controversial he is? I mean, it's such a different moment in publishing that we're in.
It really is. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think I certainly couldn't write him now. Whether anyone could write him now, I'm not sure, but it was partly, I feel like, a first novel thing as well, in that I didn't expect my book to be published, and I was very happy to be in that mind state where I just imagined it would have no readership. And I think maybe that's part of its appeal, is essentially is shameless, because it's not expecting anyone to read it. So I think that maybe as part of it is what makes him an appealing character, is that he doesn't pull the punches. And part of that is because I just thought, well, I can be completely unvarnished here, because no one's ever going to see this. Yeah, but I think the world has changed, and that's what makes me feel a bit strange about it now, because I know that I certainly wouldn't write this book now.
Gosh, it's amazing. I mean, I've often said to students that, and no one ever believes you, but the best writing experience you'll have is probably the one before you get published, because you'll never be able to replicate that feeling again of writing with no one's face pressed up against glass. You know, the difference between writing when you think no one will read it and writing when you know you have a readership is vast. But maybe, would you feel comfortable sharing a little bit of Oliver with us? It'd be great to hear from him as we're talking about him. I hope he doesn't embarrass you now.
I was going to say, I'm not going to go into the problematic passages. So I'll just read from the beginning.
Okay, great.
Triskaidekaphobia, the first chapter is called. It is Sunday morning. I hear our dial-up modem playing bad jazz as my mother connects to the internet. I am in the bathroom. I recently discovered that my mother has been typing the names of as yet uninvented mental conditions into Yahoo's search engine. Delusion, syndrome, teenage, overactive imagination problem, holistic behavioral stabilizers. When you type delusion, syndrome, teenage into Yahoo, the first page it offers you is to do with Cotard's syndrome. Cotard's syndrome is a branch of autism where people believe they are dead. The website features some choice quotes from victims of the disease. For a while, I was slipping these phrases into lulls in conversation at dinner time, or when my mother asked about my day at school. My body has been replaced by a shell. My internal organs are made of stone. I have been dead for years. I stopped saying these things. The more I pretended to be a corpse, the less open she became about issues of mental health. I used to write questionnaires for my parents. I wanted to get to know them better. I asked things like, what hereditary illnesses am I likely to inherit? What money and land am I likely to inherit? If your child was adopted, at what age would you choose to tell him about his real mother? A, 4 to 8 years, B, 9 to 14 years, or C, 15 to 18 years? I am nearly 15. They looked over the questionnaires, but they never answered them. Since then, I've been using covert analysis to discover my parents' secrets. I have learnt that my parents have not had sex in 2 months. I monitor their intimacy via the dimmer switch in their bedroom. I know when they have been at it because the next morning the dial will be set to halfway. I'll stop there.
Amazing. Oh, thank you so much for reading it for us. It's amazing hearing it in your own voice. I think something that we talked a lot about when we were studying the book was, what made it distinctively Welsh. And something that a lot of students picked up on was that there was a sense that maybe Oliver didn't feel, like I said earlier, like properly Welshy, and that he could kind of look at Welshness as being almost something that was other than himself.
Right.
It's something that was a reflection of how you felt growing up in Swansea at the time. Is that what inspired you to have him as that sort of half in, half out kind of?
Yeah, that's right. As growing up with an English father and a Scottish mother in already semi-anglicised South Wales in Swansea, which is, is already regarded as kind of insufficiently Welsh city by the rest of Wales. And there was always that sense of, or at least for me, of feeling, of having a complicated relationship to the idea of my Welshness. And I felt Welsh, but I didn't sound enough Welsh. And I think I didn't feel like there was a representation of that Anglo-Welsh character in literature and in society in general. I just felt like I am Welsh, but I'm not part of any idea of Welshness. And so I thought that was an interesting place to position Oliver. And yeah, it allows him to kind of be satirical about the idea of Welshiness. But also it's alienating for him, and he will never be quite part of that world.
Gosh, that's so interesting. And so do you feel that has carried over now when you're considering your identity as a writer? Do you see yourself as a Welsh writer or a British writer or both at the same time? Does it depend what day of the week it is?
I think I do think of myself as a Welsh writer, and a British writer too. I mean, yeah, like I say, I've got my dad's English, my mum's Scottish. So I feel like I've got those connections. But I think of myself as a Welsh writer, and now there are many more writers who write from a position more similar to mine. It's not just writers kind of in the kind of Dylan Thomas mold. Although Dylan Thomas did grow up down the street from me in Swansea, so we are similar in that way. And in fact, he had complicated relationship to Wales, so it's not that unusual to have these feelings. But yeah, I think of myself as a Welsh writer.
And so when so it was 1997, I think, is the year Submarine is set in, and Oliver's 15 and you were 15 in Swansea in 1997. So obviously people have drawn all these parallels between you, but was there something about that year in particular that made you set the book over that time? I mean, it was obviously the year of Welsh devolution. Was that a very conscious thing for you, that was a year you wanted to explore, or was it more that as a 15-year-old boy that's such a critical age that it felt like a very kind of poignant place to jump into a boy's adolescence, or a combination of those two things? But I mean, what was it about this time that back there?
Well, basically, I remember when I started writing it, that part of the reason I wanted to write about being 15 is I felt I was still in touch with what it meant to be 15, because I was quite young when I started writing it. I was 23 or 24 when I started, and I thought, I'm sure I'm going to forget the true texture of what it means to be 15. I'm going to sentimentalize it, or I'm going to forget the true sense of it. And so it was more that I wanted to capture it while it was still in its ugliness and its mixed upness real in my head. And the fact that I was 15 in 1997 was the reason to do that. So yeah, that's more what it was. And I guess I wanted that authenticity. And so I chose the year in which I was definitely 15 to write about a 15-year-old. But I remember thinking, I bet in 5-10 years, I just wouldn't be able to write about this person.
And again, I suppose it's amazing the things that people will read into your work. When we spend time thinking about, oh, you know, is the Welsh devolution working metaphorically with Oliver moving away from his parents and leaving the home, and, you know, like we were going through all of
That's
clues.
I mean, obviously I intended that, and I'm glad you picked up on the subtext.
You'd be waiting 15 years for someone to make that connection, have you? You know, it's really interesting hearing you talk about that and this moment of coming of age in a man's life. And it actually really struck me when I was reading The Adulterants that it could also be a coming of age story, even though in that case your protagonist is much older, he's in his 30s. But it got me thinking about whether or not our understanding of what coming of age means has changed. And maybe for our generation, you know, are we coming of age much later? Do we ever come of age? You know, does it mean something different to us nowadays than in that kind of traditional Bildungsroman that, you know, Submarine would have been? I mean, how do you feel about that in terms of the coming of ageness of as a theme coming through in your work?
Yes, well, it's a really interesting subject, isn't it? Because coming of age has kind of drifted now. It feels like there's lots of stories of what's the phrase? You know, delayed adulthood or suspended adolescence or whatever the phrase is. And so I feel like coming of age is no longer just about teenagers. It's about our concept of what adulthood is and what are the markers of adulthood, and do we even want those markers? And it's a strange concept to think about coming of age novel, because it's basically built on quicksand. You know, it's like what is the goal you're moving towards? And I feel like in modern life and over the last, you know, decade, the concept of what we've been told we should be aiming to achieve has either become unachievable or undesirable. So, you know, there's just lots of changes in that. But I think it's I love coming of age stories, regardless of whether they're teenagers or 33-year-olds, as in the case of The Adulterants, or older than that. I just think I guess it's a narrative of searching, you know, it's of someone trying to find themselves in the most simple terms. So that's always appealing.
Do you think we'll have a novel from you in your 50s of a man coming of age as he's turned 24 in Swansea, having returned home?
Completely, yeah. I mean, that's it, isn't it? You've got to. Oh, I don't know if I'll ever reach the point of having. I guess that's the thing. Does anyone ever feel, you know, in their 50s? Do people still feel like they're not there yet? I'm sure they do.
Absolutely. I had this amazing conversation with the French-British novelist Michelle Roberts, who's in her 70s now, and she said that all of the angst and the existential questions that we have about life and love and universe are all still happening every day of your life. It's just that when you're young, you can't even imagine that these are, you know, lifelong preoccupations, but that, you know, the example she gave, and she wouldn't mind me saying, is that, you know, you'll still be sitting in a coffee shop and having some man give you the glad eye, you know. And it's just, you know, I think it's having kind of that growth mindset in your life, you know, that you're still open to searching and that there could be other new things coming.
Completely. Yeah, it's kind of deadening to think that you decide the world is settled and that you have your answers and you have your life. Like that doesn't appeal to me at all.
And in terms of your poetry, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your comic writing, which is, you know, just so incredible. And I loved in the poem, I wanted to see how unhappy I could get, when you talk about the therapist who never lets my jokes be jokes. And so are you the therapist in your own life, in your writing, who won't let your jokes just be jokes on the page, asking you to kind of like press down on them and make them work harder?
Yes. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, definitely. I think as a kind of comic writer, I've certainly become sensitized to that idea of being a comic writer. It's like, no, I'm more than that. But I do think of comedy and fiction as needing to have a purpose beyond making the reader laugh. You know, like in Submarine, I wanted the book to start initially full of jokes and full of fun, and just to be a really kind of like enjoyable, bouncy bit of fiction, and for that feeling to tail off as he grows up and as he kind of starts to see the world in more complicated terms, and he has sadness, and he has, the world just becomes less fun, and I wanted that feeling of loss for the reader, of like, I miss the version of him that who was more of an idiot but also more fun, and that felt like quite a risky move, in that essentially I'm planning to make the book more boring for the final third, but it felt true to the character and important. And by the same token, in The Adulterants, which is about a coming of age story about a guy in his 30s, humor for him has become a kind of pathology, in that no matter how bad his life gets, he can't stop telling jokes, and he can't stop turning everything into a bit of fun, even when it really, really shouldn't be. And so I always try and have that sense of, I guess, a joke working on more than one level.
Yeah, and I mean the comedy in The Adulterants is so poignant. I think I remember like tweeting you after I read the scene on where he's on the bus and he's become, the mad person at the front of the bus.
Right.
And I thought it was so hysterical, but so profoundly sad at the same time. It's just the most amazing thing. And actually, we have an incredible poet. We're so lucky to have Daljit Nagra as a poet on the creative writing staff in Brunel. And he gave me a question for you, which you speak to a little bit, but just I think you'd love to hear him say, which he does: "I find your poetry wickedly funny, Joe." And that's how we began. And he wanted to know if its aim for you was to make people happy, in its simplest form, or if there was a deeper ethical commitment to your comedy in your work. But so, I mean, you've spoken to that a little bit, that there clearly is, but I mean, so in terms of that commitment, I guess, what are your values, that you want to make sure that your poetry is delivering, in addition to making us laugh and feel this sense of great joy?
Yeah, I think, again, it comes down to, I am happy to bring joy and make people laugh, and that does feel good. But as I guess I've said, I'm always conscious of using that for a purpose. And having said that, you could probably pinpoint a couple of poems in the book that are straight out jokes. Essentially, are just meant to bring a smile. But most of the time, I try and use the jokes to kind of manipulate the reader in a way, because when a reader laughs or is essentially charmed by something, then it allows you to take them somewhere else that they maybe wouldn't have wanted to go. So it allows you to move to darker spaces quite quickly. You can, in the moment of laughter, you can also push the reader through another door and take them somewhere weirder and surprising. So I think of it, I guess, as part of part of kind of charm offensive that allows you to go to new places.
Mm. And so when you're writing these satirical works like you do, it feels like you have to walk this tightrope. There's such a delicate balance there, that makes it satire. How do you, guard yourself when, that you stay in the right place in that tightrope and not let it, spill over into something else? I mean, how do you sort of self-regulate your satire to make sure that
it's both really hard, and it's a matter of personal taste, isn't it? Like, one person's a note perfect satire is another person's broad, slapstick. You obviously have to. You're never going to match everyone's sense of humor exactly. But I think with comedy in particular, and satire in particular, the editorial process is so important, because that fine tuning of word choices, and how close are you steering to stereotypes, and how close are you steering to or how are you moving away from stereotype? Like what are you doing to subvert people's expectations? Like all those things of satire is normally playing on people's understanding of a type of person or a type of situation. So what are you doing with that? And I think it's in first drafts of funny writing, it's very easy to, and almost inevitable to fall into broadness or fall into clumsiness or so I think I know all kinds of writing require editing, but to get jokes and satire to work, it definitely requires a lot of dead time where you leave a piece of writing then come back to it, because you have to be, any sense that you're too pleased with yourself or pleased with the jokes is immediately obvious, and it kind of blindsides you to having a really good sense of what's working. So yeah, The Adulterants, for all that it was like a comic novel, and a short one, I forget, it's like 150 pages or something, that was 5 years of writing, and it was loads and loads of editing. I think mainly for that reason, because although it's a kind of satirical comic novel, I really was aware of how many pitfalls there are within that.
Gosh, it's incredible to hear you talking about the editing process, because I think it's something that many people sort of underestimate, because you make it look so easy. It sounds so natural, especially I think with something like comedy, where people think someone has to be sort of naturally funny. I mean,
Right.
if I was to spend the rest of my days trying to write a comic novel, I just couldn't do it. I just can't be funny. You know, on the page, if I ever have been, it's a total accident, and I haven't even realized that, you know, I'm saying something humorous. But it really belies how much craft goes into that, you know, and fine tuning it. I mean, gosh, how many people could actually write a joke, you know, or write something funny and make it land? So it's really interesting to hear you talk about how much crafting goes into it, and how much, you know, editing goes into it, and that you have to keep revisiting and fine tuning it, you know, to make it look that natural.
Actually, there's quite an interesting thing about giving readings, which I know some writers like to do as part of their editorial process. And I think with humor, that's particularly interesting, because I have often read works in progress as I'm going along, and it's really revealing. I guess, like you're saying, often the thing that's funny is not the thing you've even planned as a joke. Like I remember with Submarine as well, reading certain passages and being really surprised that there would be this laugh in the middle of a sentence that I thought was deadly serious, or whatever it is. So there's so much to kind of unpredictable things about humor, and I think yeah,
and I suppose there's often such a gap as well between intention and reception that you can't control, you know. So yeah, it's so brave of you to go and read works in progress. I think that would terrify me, but I'm impressed that it's like doing stand-up, I guess, you know. I can't imagine anything more terrifying than
that's maybe the poetry thing. I was so kind of used to poetry readings and open mic nights and all that stuff, that reading out loud has always been kind of part of my process.
Well, I've loads of things I want to talk to you about, but I'm conscious that I'm sure plenty of our students and guests would like to ask you some questions as well. If anyone does want to ask Joe a question, you can just pop your name in the chat, and we'll call you in. I think someone I know who has a question on standby is Aoife Savage here. I think Aoife said she wanted to ask a question. Are you there, Aoife?
I look like I'm in darkness, but I am here. What I'd love to know is, and you've kind of touched on it a bit there, Joe, I know comedy is such a personal thing, like, you know, as in humor and jokes, but in this age of kind of cancel culture, are you even more cautious now when you're writing something that's funny, that you're worrying, or do you have an editor in your ear saying, well, hang on, you might think that's funny, or it's funny for the character, but it might not be for others? So how do you deal with that? Like,
yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's good to be, you know, checking everything and making sure it's all working and asking those questions. But there is a question of, are you able to take the risks that are necessary in order to be funny? Like, do you feel free enough as a writer to kind of go into that arena of potentially making a really terrible gaffe in your humor? I guess that's why books is better than stand-up in that regard. You know, you do it as a stand-up, it's on YouTube the next day and your career's over. But as a novelist, at least you've got the chance to write your joke, put it in a drawer for a week, come back to it, realize it's offensive and you shouldn't have written it, and delete it. But yeah, it's definitely, I would say, a more tricky time to be trying to write comic fiction.
And do you think that it will change generally kind of your writing process? Do you feel like there's more a sense of there being someone else in the room with you now as you're writing than you would have before in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, a bit like you said earlier on, ever since publishing a book full stop, there has been someone in my head watching me write. Like, the only time I was totally kind of innocent in that way was writing Submarine. But I do work hard to try and keep that innocence in whatever way I can. Like, I write lots of poems that I tell myself have no audience and are just little things that I work on. I try and keep that sense of this isn't for anyone. It's hard when you're writing a novel, especially if it's a novel you've got a publisher for. That becomes really hard. But at least I try and keep parts of my writing life where it is that innocence still exists, and I'm just like, this is only for my notebook. And it may well be only for my notebook, but that's an important feeling to have, is to just, I'm writing out of an impulse and I'm not writing for anyone.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, and it's really important, because I think after the point of publication it can be really difficult to separate the act of creation from the act of publishing, and if those two things merge in your head, that, you know, can be very difficult to kind of, you know, rewind from that again. So the idea of sort of just engaging with your craft for non-commercial purposes, you know, I think is really important for you to keep your own connection, you know, to your writerly self.
Yeah, I guess that's it. It's not that you're going to ever be able to do that permanently, but to have some part of your writing life which still feels like it always did, you know, that is just a purely like that hobby feeling. I'm not doing it for money. I'm not doing it for my career. It's just something I enjoy. And the place I get that most is in poetry. I have a little writing group with some friends. In fact, we've been doing it over Skype during lockdown, and we just get together and we open a page of a magazine or a book, and we choose a phrase at random, and we just write in 10 or 15 minutes a quick poem, and then we read it to each other, and then we move on. And it's been really fun, and really it's kind of kept the sense of joy in writing for me every time I do that.
That's amazing. If we had more time, I'd make you do that right now. And read it backwards. If only you could write and talk at the same time, we could have, you know, had that rolling along in the background. Well, if anyone has any other questions, just let us know in the chat and we'll come back to you. Oh, Claire Lynch. Yes, Claire. Now, Claire is the module leader for the course that teaches Joe's book. So this should be a very difficult question I'm anticipating from Claire. So brace yourself, Joe.
Okay. I was going to start just by thanking you, Joe, on behalf of the class and all the other guests for speaking to us. Helen's hogged all my questions, but I do have this one, which is, I think that we're the same age, and the section that you read there about the sound of the dial-up is like a kind of Proustian memory, you know, that kind of sound which many of our students will not probably have that in their memory banks. And I just wanted to kind of get that sense. The module that the students are studying here is about contemporary British and Irish fiction. So it's the contemporary over the last few decades, and those books that were really contemporary at the moment of publication. But as you say, kind of date in really interesting ways, I think, because they kind of capture a moment. I just wanted to ask you about that kind of idea of timing, that you described writing it when you were close enough to the moment to still connect with it, but I guess far enough away to see it, you know, perhaps if you'd been even younger, I mean, never mind your kind of skill as a writer, but you maybe would have been too close to see it. I just want to ask you about that kind of sense of, is there a sort of perfect distance from the experience for a writer? Is that why you can't go back to it now, because you've kind of, maybe it'll cycle back to being far enough away that you'll see it with the nostalgia, or a kind of something more, I don't know, comfortable to return to it in the future?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. I've had a theory that it's 7 years, that the optimum, at least for me, that the optimum processing versus freshness. You know, on the one hand, it's got to be fresh and you've got to remember the details. On the other hand, you have to have perspective on it and be able to actually speak about it in a way that allows you to analyze successfully, which when you're living something is incredibly hard. So 7 years is the answer. Is my opinion. No, I don't know. Again, I'm sure it's different for everyone, but I have found that I tend to write backwards to a period in my life about that far away. Yeah, for those reasons. So that I'm still in touch with it, but I'm also, I've got that kind of coldness about it too.
Gosh, I can't wait for your satirical lockdown novel coming out in 2029. It's going to be amazing, and we'll all be just about ready to cope with it then and be able to laugh at it. It's going to be amazing. Jacob Campbell has a question for us. Are you there, Jacob?
Yeah, I'm here. And I just wanted to ask, assuming that you have seen the film adaptation, I just want to know like what you thought about the film, and like if you were directing it, what would you have like changed or like kept the same, or like I don't know, like done differently? So like
that's a cool question. Yes, I've seen the film. I really enjoyed the film, and I enjoyed it, I guess, to your question, partly because of how much the director brought of himself to the film. He made it his own. In fact, talking about the timing, obviously in the film it's set in the 80s, because that's when Richard Ayoade, the director, grew up, and so he kind of transplanted the film 10 years back, and he used like in Oliver's bedroom in the film, it's lots of posters taken from Richard's real teenage bedroom, and he really like invested in it. So if to answer the question, if I were, what would I have done if I was directing it? I can tell you there's one scene that I felt really sad had never made it to the film. In the book, I know why it was cut. It's got no plot, essentially, but I always loved it. There's a fairground scene when he goes with his dad. His dad's depressed, and he has the idea that he can cheer him up by taking him to the fairground down at the recreation field. And that was my favorite scene in the book, and it wasn't in the film. So if I was making the film, that would be my set piece.
okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That is such an amazing moment in the novel. I can see why you carried it forward. I wondered if you were going to say something about this sort of moment of retribution with Zoe, because I think that didn't make it in either, did it? When Zoe kind of has her big comeback in the novel, yeah. And in terms of, say, Oliver's arc and growth as a character, that felt like so pivotal in the book, but I guess that was achieved in other ways in the film. But yeah. Do you think the experience of seeing what was retained from the novel for the adaptation informed how you thought about plot later on? What made scenes work and driving them forward? Yeah,
it totally did. It totally did, because it changed my conception of what was necessary. To see the story, the novel is the novel and the film is the film, but to see that story told without probably nearly a half of the scenes, and work in a different way was really interesting to me, to think about how you might restructure something, or what you can take out of a story and keep it, have it still work. So writing that and then working on the film was a real learning process for understanding structure and narrative and all these things.
Amazing. Well, we only have about just under 10 minutes left, so if anyone has any other burning questions, please drop them, let us know in the chat, and but we'll keep going for another few minutes. But don't miss your moment. Let us know if you would like to ask Joe something before we finish. I'd love to know if there's a writer or a poet you've read maybe in recent years who's changed how you think about your own work, or prompted you to think differently about what you can do with your writing.
Yeah, there's lots. Well, there's a novel that I had as my kind of my paint swatch when I was writing The Adulterants. White Noise by Don DeLillo, which is a novel I read probably at university and really stayed with me for its balance of humor and character, and then this kind of big scale event in the middle of it. In the middle of White Noise is this famous scene called the Toxic Airborne Event, where it's kind of a family novel about this academic and his weird kids. And then suddenly in the middle of the book is this huge toxic spill in the town, and you see it rising up in the back, like the little boys at the window, like, what's that cloud? And then suddenly it overtakes the whole town, and it's maybe like a 50-60 page scene. I love that sense of scale, that you could have a kind of funny family novel that burst out into just a bigger palette. And so I've been kind of wondering how that novel was done, and wondering if it might be possible to do something similar myself. So when I wrote The Adulterants, that was very much in my mind, and the similarities are pretty clear. It's got, you know, Adulterants starts out quite small scale, as like a group of friends, you know, it's a kind of character study, and then there's this big riot scene set in the London riots that kind of attempts to kind of raise the stakes and raise the scale of the novel in that way. So yeah, that's a book I've had in my head for a long time, that I kind of, the perfection of that form of a comic novel that is more than a comic novel.
I think it really speaks to the importance as well, I think, for writers, and it's so valuable for our creative writing students to hear, is this idea of deconstructing, you know, texts that really work well, and understanding what it is about them that's making you connect with them, or that, you know, to kind of dismantle them and understand the mechanics and see what you can learn from that in terms of your own work. So it demystifies the process a bit. Oh, you're frozen for Joe there. Are you still with us?
I'm here. Can you see me?
We can hear you, but you're static on the screen, but we can hear you. Is the important thing. There, you're back now.
Okay.
And so just before we finish, you have an amazing poem at the end of your collection, where you know, kind of subvert the idea of, you know, great poets and they're having their, you know, their singular great work. It's called After I've Written My Important Poem. And I just love to hear you talk a little bit about this and how you feel about that, this idea. I think there are a lot of kind of dangerous mythologies that are, you know, infused with writing and the writing life. So, you know, for you, what is really the important thing about poetry in a real way, other than, you know, the ideas that we might have about, you know, the great poets?
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'll read that poem as at the end, but
brilliant. Yeah.
Yes, it's very much, I guess I find it irritating and false, the idea of the great poet and the great poem, and the striving for that just seems, and the culture of kind of like, mythology that surrounds writers in general and poets in particular. And I don't feel that writing or poetry, as a poet, you become a kind of conduit of God, and you're receiving higher messages. Although I feel often that writers like to trade on that, and like to talk about their practice in a way that is quasi-mystical. And maybe I'm just not mystical, and maybe those writers are telling the truth, but I think it's bullshit, and they're lying, and they're just working hard at their job and getting better every day, like the rest of us. And it annoys me when writers kind of trade on the idea that they're somehow a chosen elect. And yeah, so I guess that poem is poking fun at that, the idea that there's some inherent difference between a great poem and a non-great poem, and, you know, one day you'll know you've written a great poem. It just seems so false to me. So that poem just has fun with that idea.
Amazing. Well, I think that would be an absolutely brilliant way for us to finish this evening, if you don't mind reading that for us.
Yeah, of course, I'd love to.
Thank you so much.
Hang on. After I have written my important poem, I will write one about skiing, because where are the decent skiing poems? And some light verse for my friend's brother's civil ceremony, even though I do not much like my friend's brother, but you can't say no to these things. Then a long one about jambes lourdes, heavy legs, a condition from which only French people suffer, And though the poem may start as satire, it will slowly attain a terrible empathy. For are we not all girded to every flaw, etc.? The reader suddenly pinned to their seat with compassion for the hypochondriac French, despite the €1 billion they waste each year on special creams. And the poem will say, surely if we can understand, I mean truly feel the imagined heft of their legs, then we can love one another absolutely, which the reader will buy into, their critical faculties by this point hopelessly diminished, leaving me free to turn the poem's final lines to Buzz Aldrin on the surface of the moon, released from the limbs that bind us to the earth. Buzz Aldrin, running like how we run in dreams. But first, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. My goodness, it's been such a pleasure talking to you this evening, and I just really appreciate you taking the time and being so generous about your work and your craft. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I know that everyone this evening would have taken so much away from this time we've had with you. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, my absolute pleasure. I'm so glad you guys are reading it. I hope you have a good rest of the term. I'm sure you will. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Happy onward travels.